Thank you, Nate. Now, it's almost 2 weeks since the damning interim report by the Banking Royal Commission, and today a committee of MPs will begin grilling the chief executives from the big four banks. Now, the committee chair is Liberal MP Tim Wilson, who joins us now from Parliament House in Canberra. Tim Wilson, good morning. Welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me, Virginia.
What are the purposes of these hearings?
Well, the purpose of these hearings are to get the bank CEOs in front of a parliamentary committee and hear directly about a number of things, what they're doing in response to the interim report from the Royal Commission, to raise individual cases or concerns that people have raised with us as members of Parliament, but also to get a very clear indication about whether the banks understand the consequences of the interim report and what they're doing to actually fix the situation so that we never have these sorts of egregious examples occur again.
It could be seen as superfluous when Commissioner Hayne and Council assisting have done a superlative job in going from top to bottom through the banks.
Well, no, what this government introduced was a parliamentary reporting mechanism through a permanent inquiry to bring the CEOs on. That existed before the Royal Commission. It's true that the Royal Commissioner has done an excellent job, but this still provides an opportunity for the Economics Committee to directly grill the CEOs on policy-related issues, including what the consequences of different directions that might be taken by the Royal Commission may have on making sure that Australians can still receive credit, so that banks can still do their job, so they can continue to be an important part or a component of the Australian economy.
I guess what the Commission has shown us, though, that unless there actually really is strong regulation or strong legislative change, they'll do pretty much as they like. So I imagine they're sitting back waiting to see what you'll do, what the government will do. Has the Commission shown you that this is an area where more rather than less regulation is needed?
Well, this is where I don't quite agree with your analysis, Virginia. If you actually look at Commissioner Hayne's report, one of the things he says is the problem is not the regulation, it's about the enforcement mechanism. So is the role of the regulators under the spotlight under this inquiry? Of course it is. But on top of that, it's also about what do they need in addition, both resources as well as power to be able to do their job better. One of the conclusions of the Hayne report was actually that there's potentially too much duplication, and what we actually need to make more enforceable regulation, to make sure the regulators can do their jobs, is actually to simplify and streamline regulation on both the side of the regulators but also for the banks.
Well, yes, but a key observation from the Commissioner was, and I'm quoting him there, there's always a striking asymmetry of power and information, asymmetry of power between bank and customer that favours the bank. So in practical material terms, how do you, the government, fix that? Because that's not a matter of the regulators and ASIC and the like. That's actually at the centre of the power relationship that's been established here in Australia over years.
Well, not just the power relationships, it's also about how the incentive regimes operate within banks and the cultures within banks. And one of the things, the government is obviously waiting to see what the final report of the Royal Commission is. The interim report didn't make recommendations, but these are precisely the sorts of things that will obviously come up today in the inquiry, but also the government will be looking to seek the counsel and wisdom of Commissioner Hayne's recommendations. But it is quite clear that banks need to be sending a very clear message that they're going to put customers first, not put their bonuses or their interests first, and that's the type of cultural change and realignment we're expecting to see today, and we want the banks to show they fully understand the consequences of the interim report.
On other matters, why are the small and medium-sized business tax cuts being fast-tracked?
Well, they're being fast-tracked because the government has put through strong management of the budget, the capacity to be able to bring them forward. I mean, we've always believed that we want to see lower taxes for Australians, individual and company taxes, to make sure that they can continue to invest in building the future of the economy of this country to provide the jobs. By having a strong budget framework, we're able to do that, to make sure that businesses can reinvest in their own future and the future of this nation.
How certain are you, though, that continued improved revenue will account for the cost of bringing this forward now, 5 years early, without risking the budget forecast? Are you certain of that?
Well, I'm confident that all the numbers and the dots and the I's and crosses on the T's have been followed through, because in the end, when you've got a strong budget, when you've actually been able to dramatically constrain the deficit as we have this year, to then be able to turn the budget towards a clear trajectory of a surplus, you can actually use that surplus to actually give Australians their money back, to be able to invest in the future of this country, and critically to be able to provide the jobs for Australians that are so sorely needed, which will generate more tax revenue to grow the economy, to repeat, to be able to go on and help every Australian.
Let's move on to another topic, particularly given your view and your role as a former Human Rights Commissioner on the Religious Freedoms Review that was undertaken by Philip Ruddock. In your view as a former Human Rights Commissioner, is there a problem of religious freedoms in this country that these proposals are needed to fix?
Well, there are issues at a state law level, particularly around different areas of anti-discrimination law, and I've written about this in the past. For instance, Tasmania's Section 17 of its Anti-Discrimination Act, which infringes on what people can say, but it is an issue of religious freedom. It's an issue of freedom for every Australian. It says that you're not able to offend people on a whole host of arrangements. That isn't the basis of good law. What this government is doing is it's received the report from the Ruddock Inquiry, which we need to make clear was signed off and ticked off by the President of the Human Rights Commission, Rowland Croucher, as part of the process. She was part of the panel and part of the review. The government is considering its response, and I'm sure it will come out soon.
But what's your view as a former Human Rights Commissioner? Does it seem to you acceptable that, let's say, a child is at a school, but then the sexuality is emerging while that child's at school, realises that he or she might be, LGBT, and that emerges at school? Is it justified that the child is then kicked out on religious grounds?
Virginia, I have no comfort with that whatsoever. My view on this is entirely predictable. If a young student comes out of school, they should not be expelled from school. And one of the heartening things that came out of yesterday, of the sensationalised story in the Fairfax Press, is that schools and school systems came out and said, we won't be doing this. We won't tolerate this. This isn't the sort of practice that we engage in. And I think that's the tone and the sentiment of the entire Australian community.
Indeed, but as has been much discussed as well, those exemptions, of course, do exist, and you know them well as a former Human Rights Commissioner. They can be applied for. They are applied for often, and they are granted. So those exemptions are there. So,
but they're not, that's actually not true. They exist in law. They're not applied for. They're just a general exemption under Section 38 of the Sex Discrimination Act, and those were introduced under the Rudd government as part of their reforms to existing anti-discrimination law in 2013. What I'm looking for, and what needs to happen in these situations, is a very fine and delicate balancing act around law about how to get it right. I don't agree with all laws that are on the books. Some people wouldn't be surprised.
Sure.
And what the government's actually going to do is respond to that in a holistic way, and I'm going to review that holistic response and consider my response in that context. I'm
sure you will, but as someone who has worked in this field and given those exemptions are there, again, I just wanted to go to that key issue, it seems to me, which is, and I guess it's something we should always interrogate when it comes to the idea of a new law. Yep. What problem are you trying to fix?
Well, and that's what this inquiry was about, was actually
But is there one in your view?
So, well, as I just said, there's one I have.
That's one obscure, small one in Tasmania. But this is a national report.
No, exactly. But I'm giving you an example of a very serious law, because one of the problems with this law is it's then used to be sought to be replicated elsewhere. I haven't read the report, so I can't go through and explain. There are other issues in other areas of state law around defamation laws. One of the things that's come, I think, generally out of the discussion is that, broadly speaking, I say broadly, there's been relatively sensible balance in Commonwealth law. That doesn't mean there isn't room for fine-tuning, fixing, and that's what the government's going to consider as part of its response, and I'll consider my response as part of that process, because this isn't an area of policy that is well served by press releases. It's by reasoned and considered minds. Well,
then it's time for the government to release the report then, isn't it? So that we can actually all have that reasoned discussion, no?
Well, I think the government would be very wise in releasing its response to the report with the report, because what we saw yesterday was obviously a very strong emotive story, which caused a lot of anxiety for people in thinking the government was going to do things.
Well, in the absence of the report, yes.
Virginia, that was already on the books, and this is part of the problem. You need to do it in a careful and considered way. If the government hasn't got its completed consideration and response, and we heard yesterday from the Prime Minister that Cabinet is considering this matter, it will be done at an appropriate time. Can you give us a timeline on that? I'm not in Cabinet, Virginia. That's why I'm the chair of the Economics Committee. Oh, I know your intelligence is terribly good, though. All right, we'll just have to wait in the dark and have the discussion in the absence of the actual report, yes? Because the discussion won't go away, Tim Wilson, you know that. No, I know that, and one of the things we can do is draw very clear parameters about the importance of protecting children and putting their health and welfare at the fore, and that's certainly my focus, and making sure that that should always be the primacy focus around what happens in schools, and I won't take a step back from that. Tim Wilson, good to talk to you. Thank you. Thank you, Virginia.